Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Reed. I'm the director of Bridgewater State University Senior College. Welcome to our first ever Ask the Scholar speaker series event with Dr. Lisa Krissoff Boehm. Lisa, thank you so much for being here and welcome. So we'll get started with Dr. Krissoff Boehm in a second, but I just wanted to say why we're here today. So as part of senior college, we offer courses every semester, non-credit courses for enrichment, learning for learning's sake and fun. And so if you haven't participated in senior college before, you might want to check out our website. My colleague Elise, who is here, could pop that website link into the chat. Our classes are starting just about 2 weeks from today. They're actually starting on Monday, January 23rd, and we have nearly 50 courses offered, both on Zoom. So if you made it here today, then you already are ahead of the game and you know how to participate in a Zoom class. And then we also have lots of in-person classes too that are available in the towns of Bridgewater, Easton, Attleboro, and Plymouth, Massachusetts. So you can see what those courses are in our website. Course catalog gives lots of details about the courses and how the learning takes place and what the topics are, and you learn a little bit more about each of our instructors in that course catalog. Our members can also take as many classes as they like for $85. That's quite affordable. It makes us actually the most affordable lifelong learning program in New England. So tell your friends and family that they can join too. And also we provide scholarships. So if anyone has a friend or family member or you yourself are thinking about joining, but you know the fee is prohibitive, then just send me an email. And Elise can go ahead and put the website in the chat, and she can also put in the chat my my email address. So you can just shoot me an email if you'd like a scholarship. We also have lifelong scholarships for anyone 90 and over. So if you know of anyone in that category, please send them my way. They can join senior college for the duration of their life if they'd like to. And so check us out online. Why we're here today is because the feedback we got from our members was that when classes ended in December, that it's a long period of time before our classes start up again the last week, or actually the second to last week in January. And people talked about this being a hard time of year. It gets dark so early, we're sort of isolated, it's cold out. And so that's why we created this Ask the Scholar speaker series as a way for us to continue to engage with you as our audience in senior college through the break. So we have this event here today, and we have 2 more events coming up over the next couple of weeks, and I'll share that information at the conclusion of today's event. But today, I'm so honored to have someone who I consider a dear colleague with us today, Dr. Lisa Krissoff Boehm. She is the Dean of the College of Graduate Studies here at Bridgewater State University. And formerly, she served as the founding Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor of History at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York. She's the author of many books, including Making a Way Out of No Way, African Women and the Second Migration, Popular Culture and the Enduring Myth of Chicago, The American Urban Reader, History and Theory with her co-author, Stephen Corey. Also with Stephen Corey, a book entitled America's Urban History. So she is a prolific scholar, and we're thrilled to have her here today. The format of the event will be Dean Lisa Krissoff Boehm will have the floor, and she'll be providing a talk with us today. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and I'll moderate those at the end, or certainly you'll be able to have the opportunity to ask her a question by unmuting yourself at the end of the event. So welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I didn't even have to leave my house, so this is perfect. Just like many of the students today. So we'll be speaking today about Native American cities, pre and post-colonial period. And I just finished writing a new version of my book called America's Urban History. The last version looked like this, and the new version will have My favorite artist, Jacob Lawrence, on the cover. If anybody caught the Jacob Lawrence show at the Peabody Essex a few years ago, he's the same Jacob Lawrence, wonderful artist and one of my favorites. So today we're going to speak about the Native American pre-colonial cities, the meeting of colonists and Native Americans, and then what happened in the aftermath of that meeting. The European continent of North America was facilitated by the creation of the cleared farmland, cities, roads, trade networks, and irrigation made by the Native Americans. And we are rewriting our books and our understanding of the past now due to revise readings of what happened in pre-colonial North America. I take a look at the lands that became the United States, not because the creation of the United States was inevitable, but because as people who are living in the United States now, we are very curious about our past and the past of the areas in which we live now. And I go out on a limb as a historian to say that the past shapes up the present, and understanding what happened in the past is very interesting, but it's also very much shaped us to become what we are today. So we haven't seen what was accomplished by many of these Native American cities, or we didn't see it at first and I say we as the European colonists did not see that. And some of the Native American cities that we're going to talk about today did not keep going into the time in which European colonization happened, but a lot of the cultural remnants were still there. Some of the cities were seen by the European colonists, and a lot of the suppositions about what constituted the Native American culture were made by those colonists when they arrived, and they were incorrect. And that has shaped a lot of the way that we've written our history, and we're trying to undo that now. Cities are human creations, partly formed by humanity's best influences, including creativity, logic, strategy, communitarian feelings, and hope for the future. Cities are also impacted by humanity's most troublesome traits, including imperialism, warmongering, violence, overindulgence, covetousness, racism, and sexism. We cannot understand the history of the United States without studying the nation's cities, nor can we understand the history of the United States without understanding the history of the pre-colonial cities. These cities all served as the vital building blocks of our nation. So Native American cities are definitely part of the story. And so our contention today is that Native Americans built cities, some of them as populated as the ones that were contemporaneously built in Europe, and contemporary American culture was built upon the ground that was cleared by pre-Columbian settlers, and the multifaceted societies established during the pre-colonial period influenced the structure of both the political arrangements and the physical spaces that gave birth to the modern world. People began designing and building urban settlements within what is now the continental United States at least 1,400 years ago. And the fundamental relationships and processes that comprise urbanization emerged even earlier. Traditional American history survey textbooks and longitudinal and generalized urban history narratives often start with the European colonial settlement and either rarely mention indigenous urban communities or relegate them to just a few pages. It really surprised people when we put the first version of this book out that we had a whole chapter on this story. Our understanding of American urban history is enriched, though, when we consider populous Native American settlements, such as some of them which we'll look at today, some which we don't have time. The city of Cahokia, which is seen here in this slide, in the American Midwest, the Great Basin aspect, also known as Etzanoa of Kansas, which we'll be talking about today, and some other places that we're not going to spend as much time on, which is the Iroquois and Algonquin communities of the Northeast, the canyon dwellings of the Southwest, which we'll talk about just slightly, the Double Ditch and other villages of the Mandan people in the Dakotas, and the hundreds of indigenous polities that dotted what is present-day California. Europeans did not encounter a land unencumbered by history. Rather, they came upon a landscape rich with its own history, a land shaped by a diverse set of peoples living in varying patterns of settlement. Some Native American settlements were quite dense, with demographics on par with contemporaneous European cities, and Europeans benefited greatly by launching their colonial ventures in regions in which Native Americans had already cleared ground and established economic patterns that laid the foundation for the Europeans to amass great mercantile wealth. And this includes our neighbor of Plymouth. Although urban communities created by Native Americans did not evolve in a straightforward manner, meaning they started and just grew until they were at their most populous height at the time of the European colonization, examining their history informs the evolution of the built environment of the United States. In terms of physical appearance, Native American settlements were often dissimilar. So that's why talking about them all at once can be really complicated. The most populous communities shared certain characteristics that not only are in common with each other, but with cities around the world. Cities are interesting because lots of people all over the world did not know about the existence of these other places, but yet built their own. And while pre-colonial and pre-Columbian settlements are interesting and historically important in their own right and in their own time, they also resonate in contemporary American culture. Our cities and suburbs are grounded metaphorically and structurally in the societies and physical landscapes that were fashioned by European and Native peoples. Europeans cleared land or settled on land that was already cleared by Native Americans. They planted in their former fields, and they walked places and traveled places on Native American roads. Although Native Americans found themselves greatly reduced in number after the appearance of the Europeans, they did not disappear the moment that Europeans arrived and appropriated much of their land. They have remained a part of the cultural, economic, and political and social fabric of the villages, towns, cities, suburbs, and rural communities that they lived in before they moved to after colonization. Nor did they passively acquiesce to European settler colonism. As historian Pekka Hamelanian documents, and I have this book right here because I just finished it and it just came out. It's a wonderful book. Indigenous Americans defended their continent and fiercely resisted European colonization. And they did this for centuries. And as Hamelanian points out, really are still doing so today. So this really never ended. This is one of the longest conflicts in world history. Such adjustments to our understanding and the way of life of the Europeans was that the Europeans had to adapt themselves and their commodities, their religion, and standards of living after they came in contact with the Native Americans, and so did the Native Americans. For example, during the 17th century, some Native Americans even joined what we call praying towns, and we're going to talk about those briefly, in part because there's so much of our Massachusetts history when we talk about towns. The praying towns or New England villages of Native people organized by Protestant ministers were laid out like English settlements. And the Native Americans who converted to Christianity began to live in these towns in Massachusetts and beyond. But these towns did not protect them from the English and the settlers that coveted their land. When the Native Americans and the Europeans met, they found that they had a very different understanding of land use. So even though we're going to be talking about Native American cities, it's important to know that Native Americans didn't consider land to be formally owned by individuals the way Europeans did. So when these two groups met, they had suppositions about land use and how people lived together that were really different. Early colonial American cities, of course, were formed on the idea that land could be owned. And for Native Americans, it was more the other way around. People belonged to the land, and land wasn't individually owned. If there was going to be a discussion about who had what land, women were very much interested in being part of that conversation on the Native American side. And the European colonists had a hard time with that because they were not used to negotiating with women on political matters. Now, the English had some common lands. We know about this, and this is often in our town commons, like the Boston Common. Those are shared lands, but mostly we understood that land would be privately held. Indians, on the other hand, did not own land individually. Many groups moved regionally in different seasons, and they might have a winter camp and a summer camp based on what was best for their community. When they planted together, they planted a combined field. So the three sisters that you might have heard about, they planted corn, bean, and other staples on shared sections of land that they worked communally, and women did that work, and they decided how much of the crop went to each family. Now, different groups did fight over general land areas, and they resented the encroachment on their hunting and gathering abilities, surely. And they did build cities. And for us, when the European colonists, when they came here and started to understand the Native Americans, they didn't see many of these cities. And so, considering as they did that history has to go on a continually upward trajectory, they thought they must be seeing the Native Americans at the height of their achievement level. And when they hadn't seen the cities, they thought that there had never been any sizable communities. And that was something that made it easier for them to settle the land too. So the Native Americans, as time went on, were farming in higher and higher numbers, and this allowed people to come together in cities. The cities, of course, formed all over the world independently, but there were some really interesting examples in Native America. Cahokia, which is seen in this picture here, is a Native American city located in the Mississippi River Valley. So it's in what is southern Illinois today. It's near present-day St. Louis, and it is the biggest city north of Mexico. So it is a city that had an estimated population of 35,000 to 40,000 people at its peak in the 12th century. And this makes it about the same size as Florence, Italy at the same time. Paris, which was a very big city at the time, had 100,000 people. So that'll give you some perspective. Now, the city was thriving from approximately 900 AD to about 1400 AD. It was a center of trade and farming, and we also think it was a religious center. Many of the things that were built there seem to give it a religious importance. They had 6 ceremonial plazas and about 100 earthen mounds scattered around the city in which religious rituals would have been celebrated. We have also found, and there's a lot of studying going on about this right now, that there are alignments with the solar and lunar calendar with these buildings, which heightens our understanding that this had religious significance. In the center of the city, we have this grand plaza, and then you have the biggest structure built within this area, which is Monk's Mound, which is right here. This is where we believe religious ceremonies would have happened. The ordinary homes, which we see mostly outside of this palisade fence that goes around, have disappeared, although we see the trash from the homes. So our trash stays with us, but the homes were probably made out of natural materials that are not making it, to this time period, so they can't be found. So many of the Native Americans, when the Europeans first arrived, were, slightly alarmed to see all these boats coming, but thought, there might be a possibility that people could live together and work out their differences. Whites and Europeans were considering the exchange of goods that was made often as a form of payment for contracts where they would be holding the land in perpetuity. Native Americans had a long history of gift giving, and this was just common courtesy when you had guests and met each other. But Native Americans really had to learn about this European idea of land use, that maybe some of these gift exchanges would mean that the Europeans would want access to that land forever. A very new set of information is coming out about this place called Etzanoa. Etzanoa is another place that was quite populous. And what's really exciting about this place, which is in Kansas, today's version of what this place is called, is that the Europeans actually did see Etzanoa. The problem is we just didn't believe them when they wrote about it because of the interpretation of Native American history at that time, and also because some of our understanding was a little bit wrong. So recently, there has been a reinterpretation of documents made by the Spanish colonizers coming up from Mexico and then exploring what is now the United States. And the University of California at Berkeley has been retranslating these documents from Spanish. And this was very exciting for this scholar here, whose name is Blakesley, and he is at the State University in this area, and he was studying it with his students. And he started to wonder if the new documents of the Spanish colonization were saying that there was a very large city located in Kansas. What people in Kansas knew was that there was a lot of exciting archaeological sites in the area, but they had thought they were disconnected. And they started to put this together with the Spanish translation, and they thought, oh my goodness, there might have been a very large Native American city in this area. So there was lots of Kansas dig sites, and there was new translation of Spanish documents. There was also a series of maps. So this is a map called Miguel's map. And this map was made by a Native American man who was enslaved by Spanish colonists who came into the area. And he was a neighbor to the city we now think of as Etzanoa, or the Great Basin. And when he traveled with the Spanish explorers, he made this map all about his hometown and also Etzanoa. So this map was very hard for us to understand for a long time. On this map, the circles are cities, but they're not laid out in exactly the way we think of the cardinal directions today. So this was confusing. And also, he put on this map the Spanish area down here, which is in South America. And you can see that the map is not, this is sort of like the Kansas area, and this is South America. So it's not sort of built on the scale that people were able to understand it either. But that helped us to understand what happened in Etzanoa. And what turned out, that an explorer named Juan Onate brought his people up to this area of Etzanoa, and he wrote that he saw 2,000 structures in which 10 people lived in each structure. And that would make Etzanoa a city of 20,000 people. Juan Onate was not a very good person. He had a brutal streak in his colonialism. So a lot of people really didn't believe him. And so when he said he and his people came upon this very large settlement, people just saw it as bragging, and they thought it probably wasn't right. But Blakesley and his students went around in this area. They actually found a Spanish cannonball that dates to the right period and shows that Juan de Onate probably did come with his people and in 1601 led an exploration into this area and saw what was actually a very large settlement of Native Americans. The map was made when Miguel was back in what is now Mexico, and then Spanish explorers produced this map, which was their version of Miguel's map in trying to understand what they had just seen in their explorations. This is the kind of dwelling that they were describing in the area of Etzanoa. And this is a photograph of a drawing made not about Etzanoa, but a similar place. And I think the descriptions of Etzanoa make it sound as if it looked like this, but was even more densely populated. So this was a very exciting find because we do have many historical documents that are written that back up this existence of this place. And now it's starting to align with the archaeological findings. So we also have a place called Chaco Canyon, and many of you may have visited this place. Stories about Chaco Canyon and the ancestral Puebloans who lived in this area of the Four Corners have been very well known for a long time. And this helps historians understand this place because the stories align with the archaeological findings. Cahokia is interesting because there were no stories that persisted in Native American culture about it, but Chaco Canyon, we had many stories. Chaco Canyon lies in the northwest portion of New Mexico on the site of the thriving ancestral Puebloan culture, where we think that people lived for 600 years between the 7th and the 12th centuries. Like Cahokia, the site of Chaco Canyon was only known to the European settlers as ruins. So when the Europeans got there, there were not people living in these grand places anymore. However, the people that lived there did build from stone, which is quite impressive. And they also built some of the tallest and largest buildings in North America. They're definitely the tallest buildings until the Chicagoans started using steel to build skyscrapers hundreds of years later. So these are quite amazing achievements. So the Native Americans in the Four Corners areas employed three main settlement strategies to build up in their areas. First of all, this wasn't an area with lots of rainfall, which makes settling in big numbers even harder when you don't have advanced agriculture. So they tended to settle in higher elevations where it would be easier to collect rain. They also lived in areas that had the most groundwater, so that could help people settle there. They may have had in Chaco Canyon by the early 11th century, some 5,000 people living in this structure. We also think that this structure has religious purposes, and these rooms that are round, called kivas, were seen as the center of religious life. However, looking at Chaco Canyon in particular, and there's also other structures like this around this particular area. A new reading of it is that it may not have been as populated as we thought. And it's possible that a very small population lived in the area, but they built a bigger structure or set of structures than they needed in order to scare their enemies. So they had a very large settlement. It would look as if they were very well supplied and that a lot of people live there. So we're having a debate now about exactly how populous it was. We used to say it was probably about 5,000 people. We do know that eventually people moved out from this area. Obviously, this is an area that's dry today, and it probably became dry over time. We also know, and very interestingly, that all these dimensions align with astrological moments with the sun and the moon, and so that it often probably had a religious place in the culture. So between the years of 1150 and 1200, everyone left the Chaco Canyon inhabitants area. And although it had been inhabited for 600 years, people were leaving this area. So unlike the Cahokians, though, who really didn't exist after the end of Cahokia, the people in this area did stay in this area, although they did not live in the city anymore. So people that are now calling themselves Pueblo Indians or Hopi or Zuni and even Navajo pull their historical story to and through Chaco Canyon. So, and what about colonization? What happens when Native Americans really come into contact with the Europeans? Are they still living in cities? And, would that make sense? And would that make them safer in many ways if they did live in cities? So we want to take a look at that. This is a map of what were called Indian praying towns as of 1674. And when the Europeans and Native Americans decided that, they were going to be living side by side, it made sense, and especially in the European mind, that the Native Americans would live in cities. Now, we know, of course, that when the Europeans arrived, that this was very difficult for Native Americans, and a high population of them passed away. We think that in the United States and Canada, anywhere between 5 million and 12.5 million Native Americans were probably living in North America at the time of contact. 6 to 7 million is given as a usual figure. And we also know that 80 to 90% of the Native Americans living in these places passed away after they came into contact with the Europeans. And that's sort of used sometimes as a way of saying, well, we don't really need to understand how much Native American history structured this colonial experience because many people passed away. And it is my argument, and also this new book, which again, I do recommend, called Indigenous Continent, and this argument, which I love because it verifies my own take of this history, was that the Native Americans had control and an effect over the continent up until about 1840 and even beyond. As we said, we still have Native American cultures very much thriving, but there were periods in which they were able to be stronger, and some periods which were more difficult for them to evoke political power. But up until 1840, which is the founding of Bridgewater State University, we have very strong influences of Native American societal structure. And as Hamelanian points out, we can really read American history as we, the Europeans, were clustered. And I'm saying we, my ancestors weren't there, but it's like we inherit this, I guess, as United States citizens. The Europeans were clinging to the edges of this colony and really living near the coast. And as they moved inland, had more and more of a difficult time trying to assert their power over the continent. So this is a map of what we are living in here in New England. Not everybody on the call is maybe in New England, and maybe some of you are New Englanders who are in Florida or something like that right now. But this phenomenon of English and Native American interactions led to the establishment of religiously oriented settlements for Native Americans who had converted to Christianity. Also, we know Catholic missions were founded throughout New Spain and to a lesser degree, New France. And these towns sometimes became Native American center places in the South, the Midwest, and the Southwest of the United States, not to mention the St. Lawrence River Valley and looking and growing into Canada. So in British North America, there were more than a dozen of these so-called praying Indian towns, and these villages were built up and down the New England region. While the urbanization efforts stemmed from the English's genuine desire to share Christianity with the Native Americans, they also fulfilled, just incidentally, a number of European self-serving goals, which included bolstering their international reputation as an English colony. The English were actually embarrassed because the Spanish seemed to be doing a better job of bringing Christianity to Native Americans. The establishment of these towns also offers the English protection, because they have the Native Americans that were more friendly to the project of colonization as sort of a buffer around their English communities. And this allowed them to live more comfortably in the area. So the praying Indian towns were seen as fulfilling the colonial project, because a lot of the English colonists had said, yes, we will work on converting people when we get to the New World. And that is part of the reason they were given the land in the first place and allowed to come to this area. Town life proved more interesting to Native Americans who lived in the region after their numbers were decimated by disease and warfare and economic issues. So as numbers decreased, living in towns became a way of having some more safety. Reduced in community strength, they had few ways to fend off English cultural encroachment. And the number of the varied land use approaches that the indigenous peoples and the European peoples had, it was very hard for them to settle very closely together with their very different land use styles. So when the Native Americans came into cities in New England, this helped them live as neighbors to the new Europeans. The establishment of these towns should not be read as a stepping stone for their integration into the newcomer society, but as an elaborate form of curtailment of Native American life and a way to forestall the inevitable European overtaking and claim of almost all the Native American land. So it's like a moment in the middle of this meeting of these two cultures in which they're both trying to have their ways of life the most that they can at that time. Once living in the towns, the indigenous groups commanded fewer square miles than they did before they lived in the towns, and it became easier for English settlers to purchase the Native American lands. So spreading Christianity had been an important goal of settling the North American continent, and Christianizing the Indians gave the English immigrants an added justification for taking Native American lands. In 1632, an English colonist you may have heard of named John Winthrop wrote the Model of Christian Charity. He traveled 15 miles west of Boston. He climbed a small mountain and he looked out over the western Massachusetts, and he said, you know, we really need to go out there. We really need to bring Christianity to the Native Americans living out there. He brought over a man named the Reverend John Eliot, who became known as the apostle to the Native Americans. And he personally took up the work of proselytizing to Native peoples in and around this area. Eliot was born in England in 1604, and he attended Cambridge University, and he came to America, and this is the thing I really like about him, with 23 barrels of books. You can tell I really like books, and Eliot must have something going for him if he has to bring 23 barrels of books over with him to the colony. He came over in November 1631, and he learned the regional Native dialect and began preaching the gospel to the Native Americans. At first, they really weren't that interested in going to these talks, and he had a hard time getting people to come to his talks, but he worked on it, and he started to make some inroads. He also recruited Native Americans to preach to their own people. He persevered, and time elapsed, and Native Americans understood that submitting to Eliot's wishes to Christianity would mean that they were going to be more safe. The colonized world offered them few viable options, and they thought this might be a way to succeed. In 1654, the General Court of Massachusetts followed Reverend Eliot's petition, and they ruled that American Indians who converted to Christianity would receive land grants. This is pretty ironic because it was all their land in the first place. Eliot worked with the Native people first to set up the towns of Punkapoag and Natick in 1647 within the area that would become the state of Massachusetts. The towns were formerly part of the Massachusetts colony, and they were governed by the courts and the colonial governor. Since the colony and the courts were English, Native people had little autonomy. And at the time of King Philip's War, which comes up pretty quickly on the establishment of these towns, approximately 20% of New England's Native residents had converted to Christianity. In 1660, a third town called Hassanamesset was born. It's right here. It's called a place of small stones. That's what that name means. I'm very interested in this town because I live in it now. This is Grafton, Massachusetts. That's where I am giving this talk from. And this is a place that was born as a Native American city. So this third town actually was seen as the best one, of course, and it consisted of 12 Nipmuc families and numbered about 60 people at the beginning. John Eliot considered Hassanamesset the most noteworthy of the Christian Native towns. The settlers here adopted a formalized code of conduct, and this code of conduct became common to all of the towns that were established by Eliot. So for Eliot, who clearly had a passion for his work, the people he believed were better off by converting to Christianity. Obviously, we understand that this work of colonization was very, disruptive to the Native American world that they had claim over. And it's hard for us when we look back at this to figure out what to do with this history today. Settlers in these Native towns built English-style homes, and they planted corn on the hills at distances from their homes so they could go out and farm. They also had cultivated apples and made apple cider, and they had cattle and pigs, and they fashioned handicrafts like baskets and brooms that they use and they sold. They also started religious services in Native American languages, and they wrote the very first or translated the very first Bible into Native American languages. The man who was actually from Hassanemeset named James Printer, because he became a printer and went to England and learned how to use a typeset printer. He also had gone to a place that I didn't know about before I started my research, which is Harvard's Indian College, that they established in 1640. So they established a special college for Native Americans. He worked on, James Printer worked on setting this Bible into Native American language, and that helped spread Christianity. The Christianity of the Native Americans blended elements of their original religion with Christianity. The English didn't like that very much, but that's what happened. And some of the towns emulated English style and dress, certainly many of the houses, but there were also in many of the rules, sort of warnings that you had to wear your hair appropriately. A lot of the rules were that men had to wear their hair short and that women had to wear their hair long. There's lots of gender norming coming up over from the European colonists here. Adult residents of these towns publicly testified that they were converting to Christianity. But as I said, they were blending their original religion with Christianity. Despite early successes, unfortunately, King Philip's War comes to a head at this exact same time. So King Philip's War is 1675 to 1676, and this was a very intense European Native American conflict that destroyed dozens of English communities and Native American praying towns. The people who were living in these towns were really not sure what they should do. And they actually did first align themselves with the British. So here we have the English fighting Native Americans who were really former neighbors to the Native Americans that were there. But now this Christianized urban group is sort of aligning themselves with their new English neighbors. To quote unquote protect them, the Native Americans were moved by the English to Deer Island off of the city of Boston. This couldn't have been a worse choice because Deer Island was a place that at that point the English were allowing their cows to graze. And it was very exposed. So it was very cold. It got a lot of wind and things like that in the winter. And out there, not, on the mainland, the Native Americans were actually enslaved by ship owners that were coming by who would land and grab people and bring them into slavery, often bringing them into the West Indies and places like that. So this really destroyed the possibility that creating these Indian praying towns could have led the English and the Native Americans that were left in the area to live together in a safe way. So going to Deer Island was not an enjoyable event for people who were thinking that they were going to be allies and be protected by the colonists. By 1735, the town of Hassanemeset did what was like most of these Native American towns, had been incorporated as a town that was an English town. And most of the land was sold by individual family members to English people who wanted to live in this area. Although there is a very small reservation that is still in Grafton, Massachusetts. It's actually about 3.5 acres, and the group is working on, these are Nipmuc. They want to get some grants and rebuild the museum that is there, which is just lovely. So they're working on it slowly. But what is really interesting about this town is there is a sign, or this reservation, which is the remaining part of Hassan-Messeb. There's a sign next to it which just says, "This is the only piece of land in what was the Native American world that was never given over to English or European settlers. And it's always been in Native American hands." Which I get kind of a shiver every time I see that, but I don't think that's probably true. I think we could probably find a few more pieces of land, but not very many that have been under Native American control continually. This place is known as the Hassan-Messeb Indian Museum at this time, but it is not open and showing its exhibits because they're looking for grant funding and trying to build out what they hope and dream will happen at that site. So I hope that I've, changed some of your thinking, and maybe you knew about some of these places before, but in seeing the world as more, the world around us, actually, as more of a place in which Native American history has shaped our way of life and is really still all around us. Not only with the people that are the ancestors of, or the descendants of these people, but also in the ways in which the community was really structured by what was here beforehand. So I'm sure open to questions, and I appreciate your time today.
Lisa, thank you so much. Let's give you a virtual round of applause. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. For those of you that aren't aware, Lisa has taught with Senior College in the past, and we're hoping to get her back maybe as soon as this fall. And this would be the type of experience you might have in Senior College. I will open the floor to questions. I see a couple of, or do I see any hands up? You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. We have about 5 or 6 minutes. One question I have, Lisa, for you is, how did you become interested in this as a scholarly exploration, and what drives you to continue to do this work and research?
So that's a great question. One thing that's been really hard for me is that my story that I'm trying to tell is that the understanding American cities is important for understanding the United States. And as I dug into it, and I'm coming at this as a 20th century historian, really, I was really surprised to find that I didn't think we could tell the story properly without doing a much deeper dive into what the Native Americans were doing at the time of encounter and even before that. Because these, although some of the cities didn't thrive up until the time that the European colonists came here, they were in the history and the minds of the Native Americans that were here. And they were structuring social relationships between Native American groups more than we thought that they were. And they just sort of exemplify, I think, the difference between the two cultures, and also sort of give us a bad example of how a good example really of how prejudiced the first settlers were, because the first English and European settlers, because when actually they first saw places like Cahokia, even in ruins, the first idea that the white people encountering these places had was that they weren't Native American places at all. They said, well, somebody else must have come to this continent and built these places. So it's really a startling example of how much the Native Americans weren't seen by the first Europeans to come here.
Wow, thank you. That's such an important way for us to reflect on how we all learned about Native history in this country. Opening it up, if anyone has a question and they'd like to jump in, feel free to do so now. We've had some nice suggestions here in the chat. Evie suggested a documentary that can be seen on YouTube. Oh, I see I have a question here for a couple in the chat. So
Yeah.
Kane asks, was there any commerce between cities and tribes, and how far did it extend?
Yes, there was a very so if we go back to the first cities that we talked about, like Cahokia, the range of the trade was very wide. We know that there were things brought up from Mexico into Cahokia, and also that Cahokian things were found very dispersed over the continent. So they had a special game that they played in Cahokia called Chunky. Chunky sounds a little bit to me like floor hockey. They used a special stone that they carved, and this special stone in the Cahokian style of Chunky can be found very far north from Cahokia and very far south. I also saw a question. So also the Native American towns that we formed here in New England and also out west had very elaborate and complex trading networks that were established. And these networks were really important for the European colonists' success. So working with Native Americans to become part of those trading networks was necessary for European success. In fact, if that hadn't been worked out, I don't think the Europeans would have wanted to stay here. So especially when you think about the fur trade, which was, a very, very lucrative trade for the Europeans.
Excellent, thank you. And you sort of might have covered this, but someone in the chat asked, if we went to Cahokia today, what would we see? And then a second person asked if you would ever lead a trip to some of these cities.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, so at Cahokia today, there is a museum, and it is a place that you can visit. In the interim, Cahokia was totally covered over with trees and plants, and it wasn't even noticed by many of the European explorers that came through the area. Someone who was very versed on Native American past named Brackenridge. He had gone through this area, Henry Brackenridge, and he had seen what he was sure was a city, and actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson, the president of the United States, about it in 1803. He said, I think that you should know that there were these cities in the Midwest. So that place is a museum. Etzanoa, the finding about Etzanoa is so new that they're just starting to think about what would happen if visitors came and wanted to see it. Chaco Canyon and other places like Mesa Verde, those are set up as historic sites that can be visited with guides. They're a little bit out of the, the beaten path in terms of, existing cities today. So they're a little bit hard to get to.
Thank you. I'm thinking of like a senior college field trip, though, perhaps led by you at some of these.
I would love that.
Here locally, I think we would all love that. Evie DeLutis has a question. Go ahead, Evie, mute yourself.
Okay. As you can see in the chat, I put in two different suggestions. One is a documentary made by Holy Cross College in Worcester, because they are now built on what was the Native American village at that time. And it's a fascinating documentary as to how Holy Cross has now kind of tried to make amends for taking over that land. It's wonderful to watch. And then the second one I put on and I don't know how many are really from this area, but Sachem's Rock in East Bridgewater, Mass. is another, I guess I would say, outstanding place. And there's an article, and I put the link to it because it's where Osamoquin traded with Miles Standish for some of the Setauket lands. And the article is very good, and it also has photographs, which appeal to me because I'm very visual. So I would highly recommend people, if you're really interested in Native Americans in our own area, those would be two to turn to. I also, when we were learning about the escaped slaves from one of our one book that we read, we learned, and I assume it's true, that when some of the African-American escaped slaves reached this area, the Native Americans that lived in that Sachem Rock community took them under their wings and protected them and fed them, which I also found to be extremely fascinating. So we still are learning a lot, and thank you, Lisa, for all you gave us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting in those sources. Those are fascinating. And I do also recommend that film about Holy Cross. So I've been working with some of the people featured in that film in a group that I've been in called Graft and Rise. And we've been working we worked to make sure that Juneteenth was voted in as a town holiday in Grafton. We worked to get rid of our quite offensive mascot for a high school. People are not mascots, so we worked on changing that, and work with our local Nipmuc neighbors who are really aware that this town has this great history, as do many of our towns. And I feel it just like looking out in my backyard every day. I think, probably King Philip's War was like right there. And, what could the trees tell us? I have a very old apple tree, just a huge tree in the back. And I wonder if it was an ancestor of some of the apple trees, or a descendant of the trees passed down by the Native Americans living here who had grown apples and made cider here. So someone asked where the sign is for the Hassanamesco Reservation. It's on Brigham Hill Road in Grafton, which is actually very accessible from the Pike. If you happen to be in this area, it's easy to get to that area. It's only a few minutes from the Pike exit for Millbury and Grafton.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was informative. We are always so thankful that your busy schedule, you're a full-time dean of our College of Graduate Studies at Bridgewater State University, but I commend your ongoing work in your scholarship. And you set an example for me to be a scholar practitioner, which is what I aspire to be in my own life. So thank you so much. I hope that folks will consider attending one of the upcoming events that we have planned for you in this series. And I'm going to go ahead and pop those two events in the chat now. And of course, you can link to the registration form in the chat. We have one coming up next week with a professor of political science here on American populism. And then we have another one, if you're interested, specifically in issues regarding race and social justice, I would strongly encourage you to attend the second event, which is Recovering from Racism with Dr. Jenny Olin Shanahan. Jenny has taught quite a few courses for senior college in the past and is very popular in the way that she is as an educator. And I think if you've taken a course with her before, you'll know. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to attend this session to get to know her a bit. And with that, we will conclude the event and I'll stop the recording. Thank you so much, Lisa. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You.